Okay, in the last video, we learned how to set a project within Nuke based on the requirements for our course and our pipeline. Uh, please keep in mind that the project setup that we are using is unique to our workflow, and it may not be the same if you were to work at a studio or in a different environment. Um, there's no standard for project definitions. Generally, different companies and different teams will follow their own rules. So it's not necessarily important to know how to set a project as far as function goes. It's more about the idea of being aware that there are project requirements and project definitions that you need to follow and to make yourself educated and know what they are. In this video, I'm going to go through the process of bringing footage into Nuke for the first time. There are two ways to do it. I'm going to show both, and then we will continue on and start working with the footage and introduce the other types of nodes that you can work with. So Nuke itself is a node-based program. Much like the Material browser and editor in Max and Maya, or like blueprints inside of Unreal, nodes allow you to control things with blocks of data or a node that each have a very specific job. And it could be something as simple as loading footage, and it could be something as complex as doing high-end color correction to adjust the red, green, and blue values to match two pieces of footage. Everything in Nuke is defined by node data and node interaction. So the order of operations is very important. It's not a layer-based system. So if any of you guys have ever done any compositing in Photoshop, or on the higher end, if you've done any video compositing inside of After Effects or Adobe Premiere, those are all layer-based workflows. The math in the background that's happening to adjust things and combine footage and color correct is actually basically the same math as Nuke uses, but it is a different train of thought and a different way of working when you're comparing nodes to layers. So the great thing is, if you understand how the footage works and what its purpose is, you actually know the basics of compositing in general. But how to get them to interact with each other will vary from software to software, and it's a matter of learning the tools and interface. So let's start simple. Let's just learn how to bring footage in. I'm going to go through the drag and drop method first. So I'm going to open up my directory and go to my project folder, which I thought I already had open, but must have navigated away from it by accident. So here is my project, Nuke example. And if you've done everything correctly in Maya, for our workflow, any of the data that we're going to need for Nuke, any of the image data, will be stored in the images folder. So the first thing I'm going to do is just bring in the master layer all by itself, and that's kind of our final render in Maya, fully composed, not broken down into pieces. So I'm just going to use that as an example of how to bring things in. So quite simply, if you've got Nuke open, you can literally just drag data into the workspace down here, and it will create what's called a read node, as you can see. And you can see a very small thumbnail of that race car that we've been working with in my other videos. That means the data is there. So I'm going to minimize this. I don't need this data anymore. By the way, you can drag and drop multiple files. So I could select all of these and drop them all in at once if I know I need them all. But don't do it until you're confident that your project is all in the right order and you're pulling it from your project folder, not your Z drive in the images folder from that stores, all of your generic data. Don't drag it from there. Put it in your project first and then drag it from the project. That way you won't lose anything. So here's the data. It's in there. Now, unlike a layer-based system, generally at this point, if I brought a file in, if I dragged it into the canvas, or if I imported it, usually you would immediately see it. That's not how Nuke works. I've got the data in the workspace. That means I've got a my playing card. If you kind of think about each node as a deck of cards, and each card has a value or a job, I've got my cards, but I haven't played them yet. Pretty much what it boils down to. So if I want to actually look at something that I've brought in, and I want to see a node, I can think of it two ways. I can either look at the settings for the node, or I can look at the visual results of what that node does. So quite simply, if I want to see the settings of a node, all I've got to do is double click on it. And if I double click on any node, no matter what it is, it will jump to the top of the toolbox and it will show you the settings. So you can see it doesn't override the other tools. So my document settings that were open earlier are actually still there. But they're bumped down in the list. So the one you double click will always go to the top of the list. And if it's not there yet, it'll just appear at the top of the list. So the node that I brought in is called a read node. So I said there's two ways you can do this. You can drag and drop. The other way is to create a read node manually. For that, you can use the hotkey, which is very simple. It's the R key. And if you hit the R key, and before I actually open the file, I'm going to cancel that. I'll just do a little bit of maintenance here. I'm going to delete this one, and I'll create a fresh one. And I also want to make note at this point. I said the R key was the hotkey for the read node. That is true as long as your mouse is in the node graph. Your mouse cursor is here. Nuke's hotkeys are context sensitive, and they can be even window sensitive. So if you have your mouse in the viewer, it's possible that one of your favorite hotkeys is different in the viewer than it is in the node graph. So keep in mind, anytime you're working with nodes, your mouse should be down here when you're using your hotkeys. So if I want to bring in a read node, knowing the hotkeys are, I got to make sure my mouse is down in the workspace. So I'm going to hit R. That will immediately open up the file browser. I'm just going to navigate to my folder. Images, there we go. And I'm going to bring in that master layer file again. If you want to bring in multiple files, what you can do is select the first one and hit next. And you notice the browser stays open. Then you can select a second file and hit next, and a third file and hit next, and you can choose multiple files in different directories even that way. And then once you've done that, when you hit open, it will open anything that you've highlighted. So I'll just, for now, I'll do two. I'll bring in an HDR as well. Hit open. And you can see I brought in two separate images. I'm going to delete the HDR. So to delete, by the way, you literally just select the node, hit the delete key, and it's gone. Okay, so we've looked at the two most common ways to bring in data. Just so you know, again, this is stuff that would be covered more in depth in some other intro to Nuke tutorials. But the if you right-click, that will bring up all of Nuke's menus as a flyout. And if you go to image, you can see the read node is stored there. And you'll also notice that there's an R next to it. So Nuke actually shows you what the current hotkey is. So if you look through this list, you can see there's a lot of functions available. But only a small number of them actually have hotkeys, as you can see. Draw only has O and P. Time has no hotkeys. Channel has K. So you can see there's a few set up, but not many. Pretty much anything that has a hotkey, you can pretty much consider that that's a tool that you probably use a lot. Nuke is one of those programs where you use 10% of the tools 90% of the time. So even though there's a lot here, some of them are very specific to certain situations, and again, will be more on the power user spectrum. and as a beginner, you may not ever need them. So just keep that in mind. Right click brings up the selection menu. The right click menu is pretty much a mirror of the tool menu over here too. So you can see color, channel, time, draw, image. So if I click image up here, which is what I clicked on here, it will show you the same information. Read, write, yada, yada, yada. So for the read node, again, remember that hotkey. It's an easy one, R, and then you don't have to go digging around in menus to try to find things. Okay, so with all that in mind, we've learned how to bring a node into the viewer. We've learned how to see its settings. And next we want to learn how to actually see the result. We've talked about looking at the settings. Now we're going to talk about looking at the image itself in the viewer. And this is called the viewer. And down here you'll see a node, if I zoom in with the wheel, called viewer. So this node represents this. So pretty much this node that we see here has all of the code that allows us to use this viewer. So anything plugged into it will actually show up here. And you can see these nodes have what are called pipes sticking out of them. If it's an arrow pointing out, that's an output connection or an output pipe. If it's an arrow pointing in, that's an input connection or an input pipe. So if I plug the output of my read node into the input of the viewer, it will appear in the viewer up here. If I want to disconnect that, I can just grab the pipe, tear it away, drop it, and it disappears. So for example, if I bring in my HDR again, and I'll bring in my car only. I'm going to bring in two different files. So now I've got 3 nodes. If I plug read 2 or my car master layer in, I'll see it. If I break that, I can plug in the HDR read node, and it will show up. I can break that connection and plug in the car only, and there it is. So I've got the ability to look at all of these individually by plugging them each into the viewer. You can also drag the other way. I can drag from the viewer to the footage. But to be honest with you, do yourself a favor and never ever ever drag for the viewer in any direction. You're wasting your time. Obviously there's a hotkey for that makes it way quicker and easier, and this is the way I want you guys to train yourselves to access this. All you've got to do is select the footage you want to see and hit the 1 key. You can see there's a 1 here, and that's it. That will plug it into the viewer. If I want to plug in the HDR file, I select it and hit the 1 key again. It will automatically switch the connection. So I'm just hitting 1. Now I should mention at this point, again, I'm not going to go into depth into this because this is something that's covered in 1,000 Intro to Nuke tutorials. 1 is referring to the channel. Each viewer actually has 10 channels. So if you want to, you can select and connect all 3 of these items into different channels of the same viewer. So for example, if I grab read 3 and hit 1, that's the car only. If I hit read 1, which is the HDR, and hit the 2 button, it's plugged into channel 2. You can see this one is still plugged into channel 1. If I grab read 2 and hit 3, now I've got 1, 2, and 3. And now switching between, I don't even need to select anything anymore. If I just hit 1, 2, and 3, it'll just switch between those channels. For the most part, what we're going to be doing this semester, just using channel 1 is going to be fine. But what you can do with multiple channels is do comparisons and things like that. You could actually have multiple viewers set up and side by side, and you could have different data plugged into different channels and see them both together and do comparison shopping and all that sort of stuff. But at the very least, make sure that you memorize the one hotkey for the time being. Okay, I'm going to simplify this again. I'm going to get rid of my extra nodes. I'm going to plug read to back into channel 1 by selecting it and hitting 1. Actually, it's plugged into both 1 and 3. You can actually have the same node plugged into 2 channels, which I didn't want to do. Okay, so that's bringing in a file, plugging it into the viewer, and pretty much at this point, once you know how to do this, then you can start daisy chaining different nodes to create different effects in the actual viewers. So I'm going to stop there for this intro to nodes and intro to loading footage, and we'll continue on with some the next steps in the next video.